Hey folks, this is Ryan with From Corners Unknown. I hope you're all doing well. I just recently wrapped up an interview with Benjamin Power of Bleach for the Stars and Vore Complex. I've done an interview with him on the website before, and this is my first conversation with him. He's based in the UK, and on this interview, we discuss a bit more about his project Bleach for the Stars and its origins, as well as a new record he released just a couple months ago called A Barren Crowd. You'll also notice behind our conversation that there are a few dark ambient tracks playing, and those are actual cuts from A Barren Crowd. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. And, yeah, let me know what you think. Thanks.
My name is Benjamin Power, or Ben Power. I go by either name depending which project I'm focusing on, but my full name is Benjamin Power and my project is called Bleach for the Stars.
Cool. So, I guess we've already done an interview for the website for From Corners Unknown, but you want to give a little background on the project, kind of how you founded it and all that?
Yeah, Bleach for the Stars came about following an increasing series of bad days for me, leading up to the point where I actually tried to kill myself by an extremely unorthodox, long drawn-out method of grotesque discomfort. However, I did recover from that eventually, and at that point thought, well, perhaps it's best if I try and offload this sort of thing in a slightly more effective manner. I had a few instruments lying about. I thought, well, what's the worst that could happen? Might as well just try and get some of these feelings out in some slightly more therapeutic manner.
Yeah.
I see the whole project as an ongoing dialectical behavioral therapy session for myself. I'm not a great fan of psychiatric services, but I do think the longer I carry it on, the more it fits into place with what I want to achieve with that, which is catharsis
Yeah.
from my own life, from the things that happened in my past, from the things I can't recover from otherwise, or feel I can't recover from otherwise.
Sure. So, yeah, and what was like the first, so what was the first record you started off with on the project?
It's difficult to say. There's two really I could pin down as a starter records. One of them is retro speculation. I didn't call it retro speculation at the time. I called it therapists.
Okay.
But I went back and collected the fragments afterwards after some were recorded before the incident, the main incident that triggered the rise of Bleach of the Stars, and some were recorded afterwards. And I went back and gathered them all together and tried to make some sense of this disparate, fractured monstrosity.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other choice I would say was Sweat Art, which I'm currently in the process of rejuvenating and reconceptualizing. It's been a work in progress for a while. That's one of my earliest pieces, Sweat Art, and yeah, okay, that's all I can say here really. It's,
Okay.
The more I go into it, the darker and more unwholesome it gets, basically. So I try to skirt gently around the edges of this hideous project.
Sure. Well, okay, so I guess as kind of like a starting point, so my entry point into your work was on the Time for Silver Flowers, and then you just recently released, or I think within the last couple months you released A Barren Crowd, and you said A Barren Crowd is more of it's a prequel to the Time for Silver Flowers. Is that correct?
Yes, I call it online a direct prequel, but it's actually from about 6 to 8 months, maybe 9 months before the events I shot in The Time for Silver Flowers.
Mm-hmm.
It's dealing with my first ever psychiatric incarceration, age 17 to 18, some of the things I saw in the unit,
I see.
some of the things I experienced, some of the behaviors I'd never had a chance to try out before.
Yeah.
It's a bleaker record, it's a darker record, it's more polished, it's more professional sounding, but I describe it as the why to The Time for Silver Flowers, how.
Okay, I see. So how was it? I mean, when you wrote or when you started doing A Barren Crowd, was this something you had thought out or at least planned in your mind before you wrote The Time for Silver Flowers? Or like, are you planning to expand upon like this? It sounds like these kind of couple together really well. Are you gonna, like, what was the thought process on writing this record? Were you, intending to write a prequel to it, to Silver Flowers?
I knew at some point I would go and write a prequel for it. What I'd ideally like is to have a triptych. I'd like to form another album documenting some of the things that would happen shortly after The Time for Silver Flowers. I knew shortly around the time I was chatting to Arn Weinberg of Cromlech Records,
Mm-hmm.
that I had a lot more I could cover and would like to cover and didn't necessarily have the space to cover.
I see.
And I knew there were more cryptic, more, I'm not sure, meaningful moments to me, which I could have covered and decided I wanted to with A Barren Crowd.
Okay. And how was it writing A Barren Crowd relative to Silver Flowers? Because I know Silver Flowers was kind of
Much quicker.
much quicker.
Much quicker, but also more painful.
In what sense
I had
was it?
to,
Was it painful because it was kind of like revisiting those memories, or is there?
I think it was painful because there's a certain veneer to Silver Flowers. There's a certain shielding abstraction to it, which I didn't want to feature in A Barren Crowd. I wanted it to be far blunter, far more in your face in its horrific content.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I was bugged by technical issues the entire way through. My keyboard broke. It would be a hindrance to most people, but I found a way around it by humming for most of the songs. Most of the songs feature some form of me humming. It sounds like an artistic move on my part. It's not. It's purely practical.
Really? Oh, interesting. I would have not have been able to guess. Or
Okay.
yeah. So how was it? So if I recall correctly, there are a handful of moments where it. You said you did some of the voice stuff in it, but it sounded like there were like some like creepy and strange noises that you incorporate into that record. It actually gives off like a very unsettling concrete kind of sound, like just very like cold and dissonant. And like what are you capturing?
Enjoying Coated Grey, I decided I would find some pieces of sheet metal at the back of our house and bang my head against them. Not hard. I mean, I don't really want to go back to the feeling of what it was for me in solitary confinement, but after a while you're kind of really hoping they let you out, and they don't, and it gets quite dark in the approaches one would take to wish that human interaction could be had, that somehow they'd come and let you out again, but I was in there for a lot longer than I wanted to be, and it was uncomfortable for me.
How long?
I wanted to recreate that.
If you don't mind me asking, how long were you in that area for, in the facility for?
A year.
Oh wow. Okay.
I wasn't installed for the entire time. That was for about literally a matter of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. and
Wow.
afterwards they let me out into the ward, to my own room, and worked up the leave process from there. But for the first few weeks, it was very difficult for me. It was lonely, and I'd never had any experience like that in my before, which I could use to bolster my psychological functioning, my cognitive functioning during
Yeah.
that point.
And how? I mean, how? But how was it like revisiting? So you wrote this. You wrote A Barren Crowd quicker, but how? I mean, was it pretty difficult to
Well,
kind
there were
of?
lots of tears, but I don't want to sound like a big wet blanket, but I do I do cry quite a lot writing my pieces, with both Bleach for the Stars and my other project, Vore Complex. It's not a happy project for me, but if I feel it has integrity, if I feel it captures that intrinsic sense of psychobiographical journalism, then I feel content no matter what I put myself through writing it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And is it? Was it? I mean, after you finish the album, is there like a? Do you get some sort of fulfillment, or is there some like release catharsis when you finish the whole
Oh
record or
God,
each
no,
song?
no. As soon as I finish a record, a song, an album of any sort, I move straight on. I think being is doing, or doing is being. Catharsis is an ongoing process.
Hmm.
It's not something that I could stop to take note of, otherwise it dissipates and
Yeah,
I feel empty again. I think it's the art of creating the songs that's important to me. But not even to stop to think about the reception of them, just to move on and create more,
I
to
see.
claw some semblance of order back out of this chaos.
Sure. So you said you wrote it quicker. Um, how was the how were like did the process of writing it differ a whole bunch from Silver Flowers?
Well, with Silver Flowers, when I first came to writing, I was basing my work on some fragments I'd had from years before, from about 2011, 2010 maybe. Whereas with A Barren Crowd, I started practically from scratch.
I see.
As I said, I mentioned the humming, which came about fortuitously for me. I found it worked, I found it fitted, but initially I was making things up as I went along. I just knew the sort of sound I created with Silver Flowers. I knew the sort of sound I wanted to create was something similar in tone, but more expansive and more,
Sure.
well, it sounds oxymoronic, but concise at the same time.
Yeah.
Something more direct.
Yeah, and I like drawing a comparison of this project to say Vore Complex or some of your previous Bleach for the Stars releases. This I I'll admit I haven't been able to like really delve into your whole backlog of Bleach for the Stars material, or I haven't wrapped my head
That's
around. I haven't delved into it too much, but comparing, looking at A Barren Crowd and Silver Flowers, they seem not restrained, but the way, like the compositional approach seems quite more on like the dark ambient spectrum relative to your other project and some of your previous releases.
yeah.
I mean,
I
how?
think there's
Yeah,
a certain resigned maturity to them, which is not always easily apparent or readily apparent in the more unhinged pieces, the louder pieces I create. The what I call the avant-garde noise poetry
yeah,
is really some form of punky industrial noise rock with my poetry stuck over the top of it. But these pieces are far more subdued, far more there's a rise sort of resignation to them, I think, which isn't necessarily present in my other more boisterous pieces.
yeah. Well, and how is it for you writing those kinds those songs? Like, you said you like there's a bit more of like a maturity to it, but you know,
Yeah.
how'd you kind of fall into to writing pieces like that? Was it, you know, was it something that you just one day were like, oh, I like, did you kind of get sick and tired of doing like the more electro industrial stuff and you just wanted to try a different avenue of sound, or was it, I mean, like, how'd you
Yeah,
fall into it?
they came, they came about. I mean, as you'll notice, Vore Complex is quite a dark project, but
Yes.
Bleach for the Stars is infinitely darker and almost the nth degree of that. It's my mood as the years went on went down and down and down. Small moments of sunshine, small moments of daylight. But apart from that, I was practically nocturnal. I was living alone. I was a heavy binge drinker.
Yeah.
I was taking crack cocaine. I was in a very bad place, and I think Reach the Stars was my only way really of finding sounds to match those sort of moods, to match those sort of experiences. Vore Complex remained, I should say, in the background the entire time, but I wasn't really writing seriously for it. I was just making up flippant lo-fi amateurish MIDI files and with it and such, whereas Bleach for the Stars was always approached with a certain reverence, with a certain seriousness that I couldn't necessarily maintain with Vore Complex.
I see. And what do you, I mean, a lot of the material as you've described, I mean, it's very heavy, very dark, and I probably can't even really scratch the surface with understanding how, you know, how dark some of the stuff gets or some of the history is. But what do you want listeners to do you want listeners to understand like the your story and your
To
background
be
with your
honest,
music,
I don't particularly mind if listeners listen at all. I write for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I write to keep myself occupied. I think when other people hear it, people like it without necessarily asking why. I find that a wonderful bonus, but I'm not looking for any form of clarification. I'm not looking for any form of
Okay.
uh, justification for what I'm doing. I like it when people like my sounds, but I wouldn't necessarily want understanding. I don't think that would be realistic.
Okay.
I don't think that'd be, yeah.
No, that makes sense. So could you describe what a barren crowd specifically refers to?
Well, it's a bit of a running trope in my work, but I was actually thinking of teeth. I was thinking of the expression "a barren crowd" as a euphemism for a set of gaping jaws. Perhaps barren as in stripped of life, barren as in abandoned, barren as in brutal. And
I see.
I was thinking also of the feeling as people around you fall away or pass away,
Yeah.
and the remainder, the few who still hang on, becoming more and more alienated from themselves, all to this unforgiving environment. And to be honest, thinking people who just don't give a shit about any of this.
Yeah.
So there's two, maybe three intertwining meanings to a barren crowd. But primarily I was thinking of, I can't quite find a way to explain it succinctly or fully, but teeth, definitely teeth.
Okay. And what do you, so with this, are you, is there some hope, or there's some, or is there something specific you're hoping people will take away from the listening experience, you know, listening to this record front to back? Is there like a certain feeling or mood you're trying to um, you know, drench listeners in?
Perhaps monotony, I think. No, it sounds terrible to say monotony. I hope it's not a monotonous record, but the feeling that nothing will quite change. Everything progresses slightly, but the entire idea remains the same throughout it.
I see.
Isolation, loss, fear, but mainly boredom. this sense of powerlessness in the face of being unable to escape. So an overriding sense of cloying, oppressive gloom. I want the record to be concrete. I want it to be grey. I want it to be barren tiles and beige walls and everything which I associate with psychiatric units, or with that particular psychiatric unit. I probably can't name on here, but I would fucking love to.
So how was it connecting these two records? So you have A Barren Crowd and Silver Flowers. How?
I think Silver Flowers is very oblique, very opaque in its descriptions, in its sort of sonic metaphors. You never quite know what's going on. But I want A Barren Crowd to set the scene as such, to be more easily recognizable, more easily understood as what may have led to the events of Silver Flowers, what may have led to whatever happens during that occurring. Or at least I wanted there to be a continuation. I wanted it to be clear it's the same mind passing on through these stages. So yeah, A Barren Crowd sets the scene and shows just how bad things may get. Of Any Age, my final track on it, I want to suggest not just, well, the obvious edges and blades and everything sharp, but the feeling of cracking, the feeling of ultimate resignation and submission to knowing it from here on in it's going to get dark, it's going to get unpleasant, and you don't quite care anymore because you're too far gone at that point. So much has happened, it barely registers anymore.
I see. So flowing into the Silver Flowers, what is I recall that there was a poem, I mean The Time for Silver Flowers is a poem you wrote a while back. Could you describe kind of the story behind that one as well?
Well, I've been out of the unit for a while. They did let me out in the end. They didn't provide any aftercare. I was left with a crippling alcohol habit, a crack cocaine habit, loads of other drugs, loads of other unwholesome behavioral patterns. My self-mutilation was very severe. My autophagia was very severe, and I'd migrated towards Camden Town in North London. I was hanging around on the streets a lot there, sleeping rough basically. I did have a home, but I didn't want to be there, and would spend so much time instead out in the streets having nihilistic, negative aesthetic adventures of various sorts, with 3 or 4 other people who had been in the unit, with a huge crowd, an assortment of streetwalkers and junkies and crackheads and all sorts of unwholesome characters. But in the end, most of these people dropped away, apart from a few lone stragglers who in the end ended up ripping me off or manipulating me in some way, or trying to mug me. I was kidnapped once.
Oh wow.
It was awkward times, but I spent most of the time after a while alone. There's a tiny alcove off the side of Camden Town Canal. I'd go there and just crawl underneath and watch the water and chew chunks out of my arm and self-harm there and write poetry and repeat the whole grisly process all night for yet another week of abject misery.
Yeah. And that kind of formed the basis, those experiences, like once you got out of the facility, that's kind of, so from the time you got out of the facility, and then you're...
I should say, that wasn't the only poem I wrote, but that's the one that sticks in my mind. I've still got it somewhere in my journal. This massive blood-stained parchment which I carried around for years afterwards of all these poems I'd written, but that's the one I think it sticks out in my mind the most. The desperation of it remained with me.
And are you so with respect to these records, and how A Barren Crowd kind of feeds into Silver Flowers? So Silver Flowers, how old were you when, like what was the time frame you were reflecting on? You said you were, for A Barren Crowd, that was about when you were 17, 18.
By A Barren Crowd, about 17 to yeah, just around just after my 18th birthday.
Okay.
And Silver Flowers would be when I was say 18 and a half, maybe going to 19.
Okay. So we're like, with respect to new and upcoming compositions, are you gonna try and continue on from Silver Flowers, or is there more to say before Barren Crowd?
I'm loath to return to Silver Flowers point in too much detail. As I said in the blurb itself for my album, these four sounding moments where I really want to dwell on in that period. There are some things perhaps best left at that point, unless I say I bring it out in Vore complex sometimes, but aside from that, I don't want to go through that point, that series of events in too much detail, whatever those events may be. I'm aware I've never quite specified. What I'd like to do for the third part of these is focus on 2010 and what it was around then.
Yeah.
That caused the formation of Bleach for the Stars. I'd like to finish my album series by returning to the beginning of the band project itself.
Do you think that there's like some sort of natural conclusion for the project Bleach for the Stars based on what you said about, returning to those moments where you found it? Like, is there a time for the project to kind of naturally conclude itself?
I think that's the final album I want to find. Me, I grow weary of this relentless solipsism. I'd like to write other songs with Bleach the Stars, focusing on, like, I'd like to do a series of it's a very well-worn topic to pick for songwriting, but macabre children's stories I'd like to focus on. There's other there's other friends I've had I'd like to focus on. There's other lives, but in terms of me trudging bloodshot up Jenna, whatever the expression I use, I think there's only so much I can reap of this before I become still and overly solipsistic and I lose all way with it.
I see.
So yes, I think this album will be my natural conclusion of Bleach to the Stars in that mode of songwriting.
Okay. No, that's interesting, and I'm curious too about some of like your influences and how you wrote. So you have Vore Complex, which is more kind of like the avant-garde, or it's kind of like that electro, heavy industrial, very caustic, and then with respect to some of like the more restrained maturity, the dark ambient soundscapes and the kind of the worlds or the moments in your life you create with your songs you write under Bleach for the Stars. Like, how did you, like, are there particular artists that influence the style? Because when I listened to Silver Flowers, I found it seemed to be a pretty unique style, or kind of a unique angle on dark ambient, because you kind of mix in like those nice waves of like static and crackling, and it seemed to kind of morph the dark ambient template a little bit. But I'm curious if that was just like a natural thing that kind of bled over from your Vore Complex project, or if there were certain artists in the genre you were inspired by to make something that sounds like that.
I'm not very good at naming dark ambient artists. I mean, I probably can't even pronounce it correctly. I have no idea how half these projects are pronounced. Lost Mord, is it? Lost Mord?
Yeah. He's great.
Purifying Fire certainly inspires me. I think there's a song on there called Dark Star or Black Star, which I listened to over and over again
Hmm.
shortly before starting my Silver Flowers ambient project. Aside from that, my influences have always been more into the death industrial, power electronics, ritual noise field in terms of what would inspire me. Um, I'm heavily inspired by Coil as well. Coil very much
Yeah.
around the Saskia point or the scatology point or horse rotivator. This period in Coil inspires me. The sheer what the fuck we are with the eerie esoteric sound. This never quite sure, is it one thing, is it another thing. It crosses genres spectacularly, and it encouraged me to think I could do the same.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. And are you gonna continue with that kind of that similar trend on your your next Bleach for the Stars record, or are you
I think
seeing some
so.
sort of or
I
yeah?
think it's I think I'd like to make it more orchestral in scope and also
Hmm.
involve some martial industrial techniques. But
You said Martial
I
Industrial.
think martial industrial, yes.
What is that alluding to, or what is that?
It's a form of I think it branches off neo-folk in
Oh,
terms of the two are often considered together, a form of avant-garde, heavily percussive, bombastic,
huh.
military tattoo style industrial music with a core component of dark ambient and avant-garde sound.
I see.
I think I'd like to involve those factors, but as usual, I will end up shooting myself in the foot because I know I can never quite categorize any of these odd sounds and therefore have no idea how to market it.
Yeah, yeah,
But that's not the important point. The writing is the important point. Whether I sell it or not, and whether I give it away, I don't care what happens to it. I'm moving on to the next thing.
yeah. So, I guess this would be kind of more looping back to the beginning of the conversation when we were talking about A Barren Crowd, but when you were, when you set out to start composing this, how did you conceptualize, um, like, how did you want to write this record? Were you thinking of each song as kind of like an individual moment or an individual feeling that you wanted to express, or is each song like a chapter of the time you were in the psychiatric facility? Like, what was the like? How did you approach
Yes,
writing the record?
I'd say you were. The latter's probably closer to the style, the conceptual style I was attempting to implement. I wanted an overarching mood of this cold, barren grey.
Yeah,
But beyond that, each of the it works chronologically. It's not directly chronological. There'll be weeks to months would go by between each separate song. But I wanted them to be instances. I want them to be a tiny unpleasant moments in this huge tapestry of
yeah,
monotony and novelty. The song titles, I'm often quizzed over quite what I would mean by them. I put a lot of thought into them to try and aid the listener in some way in routing the sounds, in thinking they may come across as cryptic. They're not that cryptic.
yeah,
I think I wanted a certain ambiguity to most of them, though. Like Coated Grey, as I mentioned earlier about the solitary confinement, about bashing your head against the wall, in desperation, about screaming, trying to get out. Um, I meant that as in grey walls coated in what? Grey walls coated, not just coated grey, not just everything grey, but that I always like to unsettle my titles and make something slightly unnerving out of them, and I think
Yeah.
that was exemplified by And Smiles,
Yeah.
which that's what I did want to touch on at some point. I wasn't sure if you were going to bring it up.
Yeah, no, no, definitely.
A
That
lot.
that was something that I was looking at the song titles and I was thinking about it, and I do like how they are pretty. I mean, they're cryptic, and I can kind of glean a little bit of detail from each one. But I'd love to get some. I mean, just yeah, some backstory. Like in Smiles, I think we discussed it a little bit a while ago, but yeah, I'd love to hear more about that as
Yeah.
well.
And Smiles documents, because these all document, they're descriptive, they're linearly descriptive. The first time that I experienced art, the first time I displayed the behavior pattern, which I've been informed is called autophagia. I'd been in the room for quite a while at that point, and
This is kind of like the solitary confinement.
yes, this is going to get quite unpleasant, to warn you in advance. Autophagia, autophagy, not a very common diagnosis, not a very common behavior pattern. It's not in the DSM-5. I don't think it's in the DSM-4. It was mentioned in one of the diagnostic statistical manuals in the past, but they evidently decided it isn't worth their while these days. None of the people diagnosed with it. A biting disorder, auto cannibalism, self cannibalism. I would either through stress, boredom, or mild anxiety start to pick at my wounds, and then well, there's no nice way to put it. I'd end up nibbling little bits. That was my euphemism at the time, having a nibble, but it would really mean something slightly more barbaric and unpleasant than that.
Yeah.
I think the solitary I pinned down as being responsible for why I started doing this. I cracked inside
And this
to a very severe degree.
and when you cracked, this was within the solitary confinement. The time
Yeah.
you were in there. Okay.
I had a pet slug I'd found in the room, and well, when you're left alone for long enough, you latch on to anything you can to stay sane. Any connection to a living creature, any connection to daylight or sunlight or voices outside. My slug didn't last very long, and I think I had a pet bee as well, but less said than that, the better. My slug didn't last, and I have a somewhat mixed relationship with slugs, we could say, which would take a hell of a long time to explain. But I turned on myself in guilt and annoyance and upset, and began to worry myself, very much like have you ever observed an animal caught in a lake hold trap or heard the sound of it? Yeah, it was a similar situation. I was in extreme pain and didn't know whether I was taking it out of myself or finding some last vestige of self-love, I think. But anyway, that's the way to encapsulate that in that my song title was a mouth can do many things. Some are things it regrets, some things get very discomfortable and uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and unpleasant, but in the end it smiles, and then smiles was that. But I don't want to suggest to people the sort of expression on my face if I was smiling following that.
Okay.
I literally went mad.
Yeah, man, I can't even imagine what that was like. I can't even imagine what that would be like. That whole yeah.
So I've been caught in the act, but I won't share that. I think that's slightly too much for the net. There's only so deep into Sheol the net can penetrate nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, are there specific, are there other songs beyond and Smiles on A Barren Crowd that are, are there other
Any other artifact?
or just like stories that are
Blazeward.
Okay.
This one is difficult for me. It's for this I conflated two separate incidents. One of which occurred within my unit. One of which occurred afterwards when I was out. But I thought, I didn't realize at the time necessarily that this would be a troublesome thing for me to do. But I look back on it and regret that I wrote the album this way.
Hmm.
There was a deliberately started fire on the unit started by one of the patients who also tried to set another patient alight.
Jeez.
I don't think they succeeded, but this is where my memory gets strange these days. I'm never entirely sure what happened. I wasn't there. I didn't see him again. I think he might have been set on fire. But I do know later on outside of that, out in the London while I was inhabiting, I did experience someone burned to death. But I wanted to take that incident and, for dramatic effect, which is one of the few times away from purely factual account, mix that with the patient I think that might have happened to.
Hmm.
It's my only experience really of describing that, but it was thoroughly unpleasant. I can't really talk about it too much. Blazeward documents the patient in question and
I see.
what I believe happened to them.
So is it? So I guess what's what makes me curious about some of this stuff is how you've discussed, a lot of these songs. Like so you're writing the songs and kind of capturing these grotesque or very like disturbing moments that you've either experienced or you've seen happen to other people at your time at this facility. Like, how is it as an artist you're kind of capturing this chapter of your life in sound, and then you're kind of putting it out there in the world? Like, what is it like? How does that feel? Like, do you ever have any apprehension, or are you ever unsure about the stuff you're producing, and like who I'm just curious because I know you said you're thrilled, or you're glad if somebody likes the music you make, but you don't necessarily expect them to go out of their way to figure out the backstory. But placing the backstory there in the songs, I don't know, I'm just trying to make some connection between the personal side of you writing these songs and then putting it out into the world.
Well, I worry writing them. I worry at the sheer experimental glee I approach them with may outweigh the quality of the songs, and I worry I would find too much pleasure in writing them and put in too many cliches or too many unnecessarily flamboyant snippets of art. I don't want this to be art. I want this to be life.
Yeah.
And I don't want that comfort blanket. I don't want that sheen of artisanry. Artisanry is the word?
That sounds like a word to me.
Well, yeah, I don't want anything comforting in these songs. For me, listening to them, and I do listen to them quite a lot. Usually trying to find a way to make them more grotesque, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't want this to be seen purely as a vanity project. I wouldn't want this to be seen as me, as I say, I don't want a dead solipsism to this. I want this to work as an epitaph.
Yeah.
I want this to be their memories, the memories of not just what I experienced, but what other people experienced as well, encapsulated forever. So I'm always very worried that somehow people think, I was asked again. I can't really answer this. It's too difficult for me to tread the line between creating art and creating a psychoacoustic journal.
I see. But is there like a point at which you're capturing all these, these portions of your life. But is it more just a personal thing for you to do this, and you're not so much worried about other people understanding your backstory?
For many years I kept a diary, and I still keep a diary sporadically now. I think this is my diary.
Okay.
I'd like people to delve into it if they'd like to, but I prefer they spoke to me about it, and I could
I see.
slowly dollop them out small snippets of song
Yeah,
rather
that
than
makes
delving
sense.
into the whole. I don't think it would necessarily be too transparent that way. I don't think people gain. I mean, I post the songs up willy-nilly on Facebook. I post them up on SoundCloud, and people dip in and possibly go away horrified. But
Yeah, yeah.
it's probably not the best approach to my marketing. They do better to speak to me about it and leave my music to myself.
Have you gotten some?
Unless they want to buy it, of course, but...
Yeah, have you gotten some positive reception with A Barren Crowd so far? I mean, relative to Silver Flowers or anything like that? How's that been?
Well, yes, there was... Silver Flowers was boosted magnificently by Arn at Chrombic Records when it was still going, and I think a lot of his fans hooked onto it at that point, out of respect for him perhaps, and out of respect for his tastes, and knew they'd been in for something interesting. But A Barren Crowd has passed very quietly so far. I haven't had much reception at all. I think a few people have purchased it so far, but aside from that, I haven't had much feedback on it. I don't know what people think of it.
And is that something that are you always like actively seeking that kind of stuff out, or are you just gonna like, producing music for yourself and as your, like your acoustic diary of sorts? I mean, is it valuable to you or important to you?
It's nice to have feedback, but I think with most of these songs, with most of these albums, the backstory would take so long to explain that I'm not sure if I particularly pulled it off well enough. If I went back and did them again, there's a lot of changes I'd make. There's a lot of things to music I would do to try and make it more straightforward, more accessible.
I see.
But perhaps it hasn't been my life, and I can only really put into it what I have to work with.
Yeah. I mean, shoot, are there other, like, what else about, I mean, are there other bits about Bleach for the Stars, that you want folks to know about?
Just the name, really. The twofold root of my band name, my project name, Bleach for the Stars. It sounds like Bleach for the Stars. I will never escape that cheesiness, no matter what I do. I can't say I wasn't inspired by that phrase when I started it, but Bleach for the Stars seems a little rapacious for my tastes. I'd rather have something more proactive, less... I'd like to clean up my cosmology. I'd like to clean up my perceptual space, my cognitive frameworks. And I think Bleach is something I'm quite familiar with from my past. How can I phrase this? You wouldn't know of my dulcet tones now, but yeah. But I did gargle down quite a hefty amount of Bleach throughout my 20s. My throat's recovered. I talk quietly now.
And is that to prevent it? Like, is it relatively simple if you talked, or when you do vocals, is it easy to like kind of tear your throat again, or is it?
That's one of the reasons I sing the way I do. If singing can be used to describe that sound, but because I got so used to talking in my throat for years on end, even though I talk quietly now and try and preserve it and bumble and mumble quite a lot about it in speech, when I sing, it both has the notion of trying to synesthetically capture what some of these emotions and some of these moments would feel like, say in symbiosis, but also, on a mechanistic level, it's far easier to sound like that if you have burnt huge holes on the inside of your vocal cords. it's healed. It heals back. It doesn't take too long to heal. It was extremely uncut, but that was almost the intended effect, so I can't moan too much.
Sure. Are there specific other points on, other things with respect to A Barren Crowd or The Time for Silver Flowers that, you want to tell people about that I may be missing with my questions?
I think I'd like to go more into the detail of Silver Flowers if I could. I'd
Yeah.
love to, but
I'd love to hear as much as you
I
want, but as much as you want to say, unless you're
already handed the reins over of that beast or that burden over to Vore Complex, my other project, and though I don't think I'll ever go into full detail of what I was actually documenting in Silver Flowers or quite what I meant, apart from the poem itself, the events and sites that inspired that, I'll cover it with Vore Complex eventually, I think, or have covered it partly, but I don't want to let anyone particularly know where I have in that. It's still very personal to me. And possibly I'd get into some legal trouble if I mentioned some of the things I'd love to mention, but people, it's an issue with, well, law enforcement might be concerned, so I'll keep away from that for the moment.
Okay. No, that makes sense, and that's totally fair. Yeah. No, that's totally. That's good that you're
Thanks.
at least you're self-aware enough of that, as opposed to just
Yeah.
spilling all the information and then crossing your fingers that nobody will just stumble upon it one day on the internet.
But I look forward to recording the third part. I still have no bloody idea how I'm going to start it, because I still haven't got a keyboard. I can't hum my way through the entirety of this, I don't think. But no, I'll find some way to get the sound out. I mean, I've experimented with novel sound procedures in the past to obtain both field recordings with my handy dictaphone and also in terms of the sounds themselves. Some of the things I've recorded, it's beyond the pale.
And do you, I know that we've talked about this in the past, the text-based interview we did months ago, but have you found heavier reliance at all on field recordings? Because I was under the impression you didn't use too many of them in your compositions, but I could totally be wrong.
Oh, not too many. I use tiny snippets. I'll burst upon a scene, or this is more in the past than now, primarily because I live in Harwich and nothing happens in Harwich. I think the most exciting thing I have now is voicemails I've taken, but in terms of going out into the woods and trying to find something weird, or going out into the bunker on the coast or something like that, with the extent of what I do now. Before in London, it was my paradise, as you could stumble down any back alley and something unusual be going on. You just try and get it. I mean, I've had clips of people dogging in the car park behind my house. I had clips of mugging. It's not the most ethically sound thing to do, but I should say there's more to that story as usual. But back to the law enforcement issue.
Yeah.
It's usually tiny snippets. I have a huge menagerie of uncomfortable animal noises and howls and yelps and groans and angry dogs and things like that, which I have taken and I'm now just flinging willy-nilly, manipulated to a holy hell, so you can never quite tell where my sounds have come from.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. I was just, I didn't know. I wasn't aware if you relied more heavily on them in A Barren Crowd or not, using the...
It's more of a more complex thing, but with Bleach for the Stars, with Apophalacy, I think it's quite a few snippets of real world carnage in it. Flux Slug does to a certain degree. A Barren Crowd was mainly me sat it sounds so romantic to say it. Mainly me sat in my bedroom studio dreaming up horrendous snippets of days gone by.
Yeah.
That's about the long and the short of it. We got the basis for this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for interviewing me.
Yeah, no worries.